Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a fate that some might argue is worse than death itself. While we often hear tales of heroic space marines fighting against the forces of chaos, of Imperial Guard regiments holding the line against impossible odds, there is another story that deserves to be told. It is the story of ordinary people, civilians who find themselves living under the dominion of the dark gods, trapped in a nightmare from which there is no awakening. This is the reality of life under chaos occupation. When we think about Warhammer 40,000, we often focus on the epic battles, the massive conflicts that shake entire star systems. But between these moments of explosive violence, there exists a quieter horror. Millions, perhaps billions of Imperial citizens have found themselves living under chaos rule. Some worlds fall quickly to heretical forces, while others endure long sieges before finally succumbing to the darkness. Once the banners of the false gods are raised over a world's capital, once the statues of the emperor are torn down and replaced with profane monuments to the ruinous powers, life changes completely for everyone who calls that world home. The transformation is not instantaneous, but it is inevitable. A world under chaos occupation becomes something fundamentally different from what it was before. The very fabric of reality begins to fray as the warp's influence seeps into the material realm. Buildings that once stood straight might begin to lean at impossible angles. The sky itself might change color, painting itself in shades that no human eye was meant to witness. Time can become fluid, with hours stretching into what feels like days, or entire weeks passing in what seems like mere moments. But these physical changes, disturbing as they are, pale in comparison to what happens to the people themselves. The human population of an occupied world finds itself caught between two terrible fates. They can resist, clinging to their faith in the God Emperor and facing almost certain death at the hands of their new masters. Or they can adapt, bending their knees to the dark gods and slowly losing everything that made them human in the first place. There is no good choice, no path that leads to anything resembling the life they once knew. It is important to understand that not all chaos-controlled worlds are the same. There is a distinction between a world under chaos occupation and what is known as a demon world. An occupied world still exists primarily in real space. In the material universe we understand. The laws of physics, while strained and bent, still function in recognizable ways. People still need to eat, still need shelter, still perform the basic functions of survival. A demon world, by contrast, has been so thoroughly corrupted by the warp that it exists partially in that hellish dimension. On such worlds, reality itself is subject to the whims of whatever demon prince rules over it. The very landscape might reshape itself according to the ruler's desires, and the unfortunate mortals who inhabit such places are more like playthings for their demonic overlords than anything resembling true inhabitants. The worlds we will focus on today are the occupied ones, the planets where human civilization continues in some twisted form under the rule of chaos. These are the places where life goes on, after a fashion, where people wake up each day and go about their business, albeit under circumstances that would drive most Imperial citizens to madness or despair. Understanding what happens on these worlds requires us to look beyond the grand battles and focus on the everyday reality of existence under the dominion of the dark gods. Consider for a moment what it means for a world to fall to chaos in the first place. Most Imperial planets exist in a state of rigid order, their populations carefully controlled through a combination of religious indoctrination, political authority, and when necessary, brutal military force. The Imperium is not kind to its citizens, but it at least provides structure, a framework within which life can be lived, however harsh that life might be. When chaos comes, that structure collapses. The authorities who once maintained order either flee die, or worse, throw in their lot with the invaders. The temples where citizens once prayed to the emperor are desecrated or destroyed. The laws that govern society are replaced with new and terrible commandments from the chaos warlords who now rule. The speed at which this transformation occurs varies greatly. Some worlds fall in a matter of days, their defenses crumbling before a massive chaos assault that leaves little room for organized resistance. Others might endure months or even years of warfare before finally succumbing, their populations depleted by constant fighting and their resources exhausted. In some cases, a world might not fall through military conquest at all, but through corruption from within. A chaos cult working in secret might grow so powerful that it can seize control through political maneuvering or surprise uprising, presenting the population with a new reality overnight. Regardless of how it happens, the moment when chaos takes control marks a fundamental break with the past. Everything that came before, all the routines and expectations that shaped daily life, becomes irrelevant. The civilians of such a world must now learn a new way of existing, must adapt to circumstances that would have been unthinkable just a short time before. And for most of them, this adaptation will eventually mean losing something essential of what they once were. The initial conquest. The first days of chaos occupation are perhaps the most chaotic and terrifying, if we can use that word without irony. When a world falls to the forces of the dark gods, the transition from imperial rule to chaos dominion is marked by violence, terror, and a deliberate campaign to break the will of the population. The new rulers understand that they must establish their dominance quickly and absolutely. Any lingering hope among the civilian population that things might return to normal, that the emperor's forces might come to liberate them, must be crushed as thoroughly as possible. The methods used to achieve this psychological subjugation vary depending on which chaos faction has taken control and what their ultimate goals are for the conquered world. However, certain patterns emerge across most chaos occupations, a grim playbook that has been used on countless worlds throughout the galaxy. Understanding these patterns helps us grasp the sheer horror of what ordinary people face in those crucial first days and weeks. Typically, the first action taken by chaos forces after securing military control is to gather the population. In cities, this might mean forcing everyone to assemble in central squares or stadiums. In more rural areas, people might be rounded up from their homes and brought to designated gathering points. The purpose of this assembly is multifold. It allows the conquerors to take a census of sorts, to understand the size and composition of the population they now control. But more importantly, it provides an opportunity for a demonstration of power that will set the tone for everything that follows. What happens at these gatherings is deliberately calculated to inflict maximum psychological trauma. The leaders of the old regime, the planetary governor, military commanders, ecclesiarchy priests, anyone who held authority under imperial rule, they are brought forward before the assembled crowds. What happens next is designed not just to eliminate potential resistance leaders, but to send an unmistakable message to everyone watching. The executions are not quick or merciful. They are drawn out, spectacular in their brutality, meant to be witnessed and remembered. For a population raised on the imperial creed, taught from birth to venerate the emperor and trust in the authority of his representatives, watching these figures die in such horrible ways creates a profound psychological rupture. If the governor, appointed by terror itself, can be brought so low, what hope does an ordinary citizen have? If the priests, who claim to speak with the emperor's authority, can be made to scream and beg for mercy, what does that say about the power of the god emperor? These are the questions that chaos wants the population to ask themselves, the doubts they want to plant in every mind. But the terror does not end with the deaths of the leadership. The first purge typically extends much further, targeting anyone who might be capable of organizing resistance. Military personnel who have not already fled or been killed in combat are hunted down. Members of the Adeptus Arbits, the Imperium's law enforcement, are given special attention. Their deaths often made into public spectacles. Teachers, administrators, anyone with education or influence, they all become targets. The goal is to decapitate not just the political leadership, but the entire social infrastructure that might give the population the means to coordinate opposition. During this initial period, the rules governing civilian life are deliberately unclear and arbitrary. People are not told what is expected of them, what actions might be permitted or forbidden. This uncertainty is intentional. When no one knows what might bring punishment, everyone becomes paralyzed with fear, afraid to do anything that might draw unwanted attention. Random violence becomes a tool of control. A person might be pulled from a crowd for no apparent reason and subjected to punishment or execution, not because they did anything wrong by any standard, but simply to remind everyone else that they exist at the mercy of their new masters. The religious dimension of this initial conquest is particularly significant. Chaos does not simply want political control, it seeks to corrupt the very souls of the conquered population. The temples and cathedrals dedicated to the emperor become primary targets, not for simple destruction, but for desecration. The symbols of the imperial faith are defaced or perverted. Statues of the emperor might be torn down and replaced with monuments to the chaos gods, or worse, the original statues might be modified, their holy features twisted into mockeries that blend imperial imagery with chaotic corruption. This approach is deliberate, designed to create cognitive dissonance and spiritual confusion among the faithful. In some cases, particularly when the occupation is planned to be long-term, priests of the ecclesiarchy are not simply killed, but are instead forced to participate in profane rituals. The psychological warfare value of this is immense. Imagine being a faithful imperial citizen and watching your spiritual guide, someone you trusted to intercede with the emperor on your behalf, being made to speak blasphemies or conduct ceremonies honoring the dark gods. The betrayal, whether real or coerced, serves to undermine whatever remains of the population's faith in the old order. Food and resources become weapons during the initial occupation. The distribution systems that once provided for the population are seized and put under strict chaos control. Rations might be distributed according to arbitrary criteria or withheld entirely for periods of time. The message is clear. The invaders control not just your freedom, but your very survival. Those who cooperate, who show themselves willing to adapt to the new reality, might receive slightly better treatment. Those who show any sign of resistance face starvation. This creates divisions within the population, turning neighbor against neighbor as people compete for limited resources or curry favor with their oppressors. The physical environment of the world begins to change almost immediately. Even before any supernatural corruption takes hold, the simple fact of chaos occupation alters the landscape. Buildings are repurposed, with military installations and government centers being converted into fortresses for the occupation forces. Public spaces are transformed. Where once there might have been parks or plazas, where citizens could gather freely, now there are checkpoints and killing zones designed to control movement and make rebellion difficult. The architecture of control replaces the architecture of civilian life. For those civilians trying to survive these first terrible days, every decision becomes fraught with impossible moral calculus. Do you hide in your home and hope to avoid notice, risking that you might be caught and punished for not reporting to the mandatory assemblies? Do you attend the gatherings and witness horrors that will haunt you forever? Do you speak when spoken to, risking saying the wrong thing, or do you remain silent and possibly be seen as defiant? There are no good choices, only variations of terrible ones. Children present a particular challenge during this transition. Parents who have spent years teaching their children to revere the emperor, to obey imperial authority, to believe in the righteousness of the Imperium, now must figure out how to protect their offspring in a world where those teachings could get them killed. Do you try to maintain your children's faith in the old ways, knowing that if they speak those beliefs aloud, they might be executed? Or do you begin the heartbreaking process of teaching them new lies, corrupting their understanding of the universe in order to keep them alive? The first days of occupation also see the beginning of collaboration. While many people resist, either actively or through passive non-compliance, there are always those who choose to work with the conquerors. Some do so purely out of self-preservation, calculating that their best chance of survival lies in making themselves useful to the new regime. Others, however, embrace the change with genuine enthusiasm. These are often people who harbored secret resentments against the old order, who felt oppressed or overlooked by imperial rule. For them, the chaos occupation represents opportunity. They can gain power, settle old scores, elevate themselves by tearing others down. These collaborators become a crucial part of the occupation infrastructure. The chaos warlords and their forces, particularly if they are planning a long-term occupation, rather than simply raiding a world for slaves and resources, need local knowledge. They need people who understand the geography, the social networks, the logistics of keeping a planet functioning. Collaborators provide this, becoming administrators, enforcers, informants. Their presence creates another layer of horror for the occupied population. The knowledge that they cannot trust their neighbors, that betrayal might come from someone they have known their entire lives. As the initial conquest phase gives way to the establishment of a more permanent occupation regime, the sheer uncertainty of those first days begins to be replaced by a terrible clarity. The new rules become known, the expectations are communicated, and the population starts to understand what kind of life they can expect under chaos rule. This is when the real horror begins, when people realize that this nightmare is not temporary, that liberation is not coming, and that they will have to find a way to exist in this new reality or die trying to escape it. Daily life under different chaos. Gods. One of the most important factors determining what life is like under chaos occupation is which of the dark gods holds primary influence over the conquering forces. Each of the four major chaos gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, has their own particular vision for how a conquered world should be run, their own way of corrupting and controlling a human population. Understanding these differences is crucial to grasping the full scope of what civilians might face. Let us examine each in turn, though we must acknowledge that many worlds fall under the control of chaos undivided forces that might blend elements of all four in a horrifying amalgamation. For worlds that fall under the dominion of Khorne, the blood god, life becomes defined by violence in its purest form. Khorne cares nothing for subtlety or long-term planning. His followers seek only slaughter, only bloodshed, only the eternal conflict that feeds their god's insatiable hunger. For civilians trapped on a Khornate world, this means existence becomes a constant struggle for survival in an environment designed to promote violence at every level. The daily routine on a Khorne-occupied world revolves around combat. Citizens are not allowed to live peaceful lives, not permitted to simply work and rest and raise families. Instead, they are forced to participate in a culture of perpetual warfare. This might take many forms, depending on the specific preferences of the Khornate warlords in charge. Arena combat is common, with civilians being forced to fight each other for the entertainment of their masters. These are not sporting competitions with rules and safeguards. They are fights to the death, where victory means temporary survival and defeat means becoming one more skull offered to the blood god. But the violence is not confined to formalized arenas. Street fighting might be encouraged or even mandated. Certain districts of a city might be designated as free combat zones, where killing is not just permitted, but expected. Citizens venturing through these areas must be prepared to defend themselves at any moment. The weak, the elderly, the very young, they have little chance in such an environment. Khornate occupation creates a brutal social Darwinism, where only the strongest and most vicious survive for long. Work assignments under Khornate rule typically involve supporting the war machine in some way. Munitions factories run around the clock, producing weapons and ammunition. Citizens might be forced to work in these facilities under brutal conditions, with little concern for safety. Accidents are common and often fatal, but this is seen as acceptable, even desirable. After all, any death adds to the tally of bloodshed that pleases Horn. Foundries produce armor and blades. Training facilities churn out new warriors, taking anyone deemed fit for combat and putting them through merciless conditioning programs designed to strip away any vestige of mercy or compassion. There is no room for the weak or the pacific on a Hornate world. Those who cannot or will not fight are typically killed outright, often in ritual sacrifices. The blood god demands skulls, and the skulls of weaklings are considered inferior offerings, but they are still offerings nonetheless. This creates a constant pressure on everyone to demonstrate their willingness and ability to commit violence. A citizen who shows mercy, who refuses to kill when ordered, who displays any kind of gentleness or compassion, they mark themselves for death. Families are disrupted under Hornate rule. Children are taken from their parents at young ages to be trained as warriors. The bonds between parent and child are seen as weaknesses, sentimentality that has no place in Khorne's realm. If a parent shows too much distress at having their child taken, they might be killed for displaying such weakness. If they show too little distress, they might be suspected of already being corrupted, of caring more for their own survival than for their offspring. There is no correct response, no way to navigate these situations that does not carry terrible cost. The religious life of a Hornate world is straightforward but horrifying. Worship of the blood god requires sacrifice, and lots of it. Public ceremonies involve the mass slaughter of prisoners, of those deemed unfit, of anyone the Hornate priests decide should be offered up. Citizens are required to attend these events, to witness the bloodletting, to cheer and celebrate as people are killed in gruesome ways. Those who attend with insufficient enthusiasm might find themselves marked as the next sacrifice. The pressure to participate, to show genuine fervor for the violence, is immense. Contrast this with life under Nurgle's dominion, and we find a very different but equally horrific reality. Nurgle is the plague god, the lord of decay and entropy. His gift to his followers is a kind of terrible immortality, a life sustained even as the body rots and fails. For civilians on a Nurgle-controlled world, existence becomes an endless decline into sickness and corruption, but one from which there is no release through death. The first and most obvious change on a Nurgle world is the spread of disease. Plagues sweep through the population with devastating effect. At first, people die in massive numbers, their bodies succumbing to infections and illnesses for which there is no cure. But over time, as the warp's influence grows stronger, something even worse happens. People stop dying. The diseases continue to ravage their bodies, eating away at their flesh, covering them in sores and lesions, filling them with parasites and rot, but they continue to live. They continue to walk and talk and work, even as their bodies decompose around them. This twisted immortality is Nurgle's greatest gift to his followers, and it is inflicted upon the conquered populations of his worlds, whether they want it or not. A citizen might watch their skin peel away, might feel maggots eating through their organs, might lose body parts to gangrene and decay, but they do not die. They continue to exist, their consciousness trapped in a body that has become a living nightmare. And the horrible part is that eventually, many of them stop being horrified. Nurgle's influence brings a kind of peace, a numbing acceptance. The pain fades, replaced by a contentment with the decay, a joy in the corruption. The victims become willing participants in their own degradation. Work on a Nurgle world centers around spreading the plague god's gifts. Disease cultivation becomes a primary industry. Gardens are planted with toxic blooms that release spores capable of causing horrific illnesses. Laboratories work on breeding new plagues. new diseases to be unleashed on other worlds. The population is conscripted into this work, forced to tend to plague gardens or work in contamination facilities. Protection against the diseases they work with is minimal or non-existent, but this is not a concern. Everyone on the planet is already infected with something. One more disease hardly matters. The social structure of a Nurgle world reflects the god's nature. There is a kind of egalitarianism to it, a leveling effect where everyone is equally diseased, equally rotting. The distinctions that might have existed before the occupation, between rich and poor, educated and ignorant, they matter much less now. Everyone is united in their corruption. Everyone shares in the decay. This can create a strange sense of community, a camaraderie of the damned. People help each other, not out of any noble impulse, but out of a shared understanding that they are all suffering the same fate. Family structures persist on Nurgle worlds, but in twisted forms. Children are born already infected, their tiny bodies showing signs of disease from birth. Parents care for these sick offspring, not with horror, but with the same numbed acceptance that characterizes all life under Nurgle. The concept of health, of what a body should look and feel like when functioning properly, gradually fades from collective memory. A new generation grows up knowing only disease, only decay, and they do not see it as wrong or terrible. It is simply how things are, how things have always been in their experience. Religious worship of Nurgle is less violent than cornate ceremonies, but no less disturbing. Services involve the blessing of plagues, the consecration of diseases. Congregations gather to celebrate new infections, to admire particularly virulent strains of illness. There is singing and chanting, but the voices are ruined by disease, producing a cacophony of coughs and wheezes and gurgling sounds. The temples stink of rot and corruption, but the worshippers do not notice or care. To them, these are sweet smells, the perfume of their god's favor. Moving on to Tzeentch, the changer of ways, we encounter a very different form of occupation. Tzeentch is the god of change, of sorcery, of plots within plots. A world under his influence becomes a place of constant flux and uncertainty, where nothing is stable, where reality itself seems to shift based on the whims of the god and his servants. For civilians trying to survive on such a world, the challenge is not primarily physical, but mental. They must navigate an environment that refuses to be predictable, that changes its rules without warning or explanation. The physical landscape of a Tzeentchian world is subject to sudden and dramatic alterations. A building might change its architecture overnight, growing new wings or shifting its internal layout so that rooms that once connected directly are now separated by impossible distances. Streets might rearrange themselves, making it difficult to navigate even familiar neighborhoods. The sky displays colors and patterns that hurt to look at, suggesting mathematical relationships and geometric forms that no human mind was meant to perceive. But these physical changes, disorienting as they are, pale in comparison to the social and political upheavals that characterize life under Tzeentch. The power structure on a Tzeentchian world is constantly shifting. Today's ruling cabal might be tomorrow's executed traitors. Alliances form and dissolve with bewildering speed. Citizens must learn to read the constantly changing political winds, to understand which faction is currently ascendant, to know when it is safe to speak and when silence is the only protection. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia that permeates every aspect of life. No one can be trusted, because everyone is potentially part of some larger scheme or plot. Your neighbor might be an informant today and a rebel tomorrow. The official who gave you orders yesterday might have fallen from favor by today, and following those orders might now be considered a crime. There is no stable authority to appeal to, no consistent set of rules to follow. Everything is subject to change without notice. Work under Tzeentchian rule often involves tasks related to sorcery or arcane research. Even civilians with no particular aptitude for psychic powers might be conscripted into supporting magical endeavors. This could mean serving as test subjects for experimental spells, or working in libraries that catalog forbidden knowledge, or participating in rituals whose purpose they do not understand. The work is mentally and spiritually dangerous. Exposure to warp energies can drive people mad, can warp their bodies in ways that reflect Tzeentch's chaotic nature. Mutations are common, with citizens developing extra limbs, eyes in strange places, or even more bizarre alterations. The educational system on a Tzeentchian world, if such can be said to exist, focuses on teaching people to think in ways that please the changer of ways. This means embracing paradox, learning to hold contradictory ideas in mind simultaneously, developing the ability to see multiple layers of meaning in every statement or situation. For the human mind, not evolved for such cognitive gymnastics, this is profoundly damaging. Madness is not an unfortunate side effect, but an accepted outcome, even a desired one. To go mad in service to Tzeentch is to open yourself to his influence, to become a better vessel for his power. Families under Tzeentchian rule struggle with the inconsistency of their environment. Children grow up unable to rely on anything remaining the same. Today's truth becomes tomorrow's heresy. What they were taught yesterday might be contradicted tomorrow and punished as ignorance the day after.
You know, I have to pause here for a moment because this whole situation with Gullyman really gets to me on a personal level. Imagine waking up after 10,000 years, hoping your father will have answers, will give you guidance, will acknowledge everything you sacrificed, and instead you find out you were never more than a hammer in his toolbox. That is genuinely heartbreaking. What makes it worse is that Gullyman can't even be angry about it publicly. He has to smile, attend the ceremonies, let people call him a blessed son while knowing the truth. That kind of isolation, carrying knowledge that would shatter everyone around you if they knew it, that's a special kind of torture. And honestly, I think that's what makes Gullyman one of the most tragic characters in 40k. He's too competent to quit, too dutiful to walk away, and too aware to ever have peace. Sometimes I wonder if he envies his brothers who died during the heresy. At least their struggles ended. Anyways, let's continue the story.
This creates a deep-seated anxiety and a difficulty forming stable attachments. How can you love something, trust something, believe in something when everything changes? The psychological damage done to generations raised under such conditions is incalculable. Religious practice on a Tzeentchian world is arcane and impenetrable. Ceremonies involve complex rituals whose meaning is never explained, chants in languages that shift and change even as they are spoken. Worshippers might be expected to learn prayers that are different each time they recite them. The temples themselves are architectural impossibilities, structures that could not exist according to any rational geometry. Attending services is mandatory but bewildering, leaving participants more confused than enlightened, which is exactly the point. Finally, we come to Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, and here we encounter a form of occupation that is perhaps the most insidious, because it begins with a kind of seduction. Slaanesh does not rule through obvious violence or disease or confusion, at least not at first. Instead, the Dark Prince offers the occupied population something they desperately need, a way to escape the horror of their situation, a means of feeling something other than fear and despair. In the early stages of a Slaaneshi occupation, life might actually seem to improve for many people. The brutality of the conquest gives way to a strange kind of freedom. Restrictions are lifted. Citizens are encouraged to pursue their desires, to seek pleasure in whatever form appeals to them. Entertainment becomes a focus. Festivals are organized, celebrations that seem to offer a reprieve from the grinding despair of occupied life. For a population traumatized by conquest, this can seem like mercy, like an unexpected gift. But this is a trap, and a subtle one. The pleasures offered by Slaanesh are not ordinary joys. They are enhanced, intensified, pushed beyond the boundaries of what human nervous systems were meant to experience. What starts as relief from pain gradually transforms into an addiction to sensation. People begin to chase ever more intense experiences, seeking highs that can only be achieved by crossing lines they would never have considered before. The work on a Slaaneshi world reflects this emphasis on sensation and experience. Citizens might be employed in entertainment industries, producing music or art or performances designed to elicit extreme emotional responses. Others work in facilities that manufacture drugs or other substances that alter consciousness and enhance sensation. Still others serve more directly, becoming attendants in the hedonistic celebrations that characterize Slaaneshi culture. All of these roles require the workers themselves to partake in the excess, to sample the products and services they create. There is no distinction between work and participation in the corruption. As time passes, the pleasures become more extreme and more disturbing. What satisfied before no longer suffices. Citizens need stronger stimulation, more intense experiences. This leads down dark paths. Violence becomes entertainment. Suffering becomes a source of pleasure. The boundary between giving and receiving pain dissolves. People commit acts that would have horrified them before the occupation, and they do so not under duress, but willingly, eagerly, because those acts provide the intense sensations they have become addicted to. Slaaneshi corruption is particularly cruel because it makes people complicit in their own degradation. Unlike Khornate slaves who fight because they will be killed if they do not, unlike Nurglite victims who accept disease because they have no choice, citizens on a Slaaneshi world participate willingly in their corruption. They make choices over and over to pursue pleasure, even as that pursuit destroys them. They know what they are doing is wrong, but the addiction is too strong, the need for sensation too powerful. This creates a unique kind of horror, the recognition that you are becoming a monster and the inability to stop yourself. Family structures collapse completely under Slaaneshi influence. The bonds between parents and children, between spouses, all of these are subjected to the same logic of excess and experience. Every relationship becomes a vehicle for seeking new sensations, new pleasures. The love that once existed is corrupted into something possessive and consuming. Children are not protected or nurtured, but used, exploited in the endless quest for new experiences. The destruction of the family unit is not mandated by any law, but happens naturally as everyone pursues their own descent into excess. Religious worship of Slaanesh is orgiastic and overwhelming. Ceremonies are designed to assault all the senses simultaneously, to create a state of sensory overload that borders on or crosses into actual pain. Music at volumes that rupture eardrums, lights that blind, incense so thick it is hard to breathe, physical sensations that blur pleasure and pain into a single, overwhelming experience. Worshippers emerge from these services physically and mentally exhausted, but craving more, always more. The addiction ensures that they will return, that they will continue to participate even as it destroys them. Of course, many worlds fall under Chaos Undivided, controlled by warlords who draw power from all four dark gods, or who have not pledged themselves exclusively to anyone. On these worlds, elements of all four corruptions might be present simultaneously. Citizens might face violence and disease, shifting realities and corrupting pleasures all at once. The variety of horrors actually makes survival more difficult in some ways, because there is no single set of rules to learn, no consistent approach that can be relied upon. Each day might bring a different challenge, a different form of corruption, to navigate or resist. Systems of control and enforcement. Understanding the daily horror of life under chaos occupation requires examining not just what people experience, but how that experience is enforced. The forces of chaos, for all their love of disorder and corruption, understand the necessity of control. A conquered population that is allowed too much freedom might organize resistance, might flee, might find ways to undermine the occupation. To prevent this, chaos warlords implement systems of control that are both brutal and sophisticated, designed to keep civilians in line through a combination of fear, surveillance, and the strategic use of horrific punishments. The backbone of any long-term chaos occupation is the military force that maintains order. Unlike the howling mobs of cultists that often make up the initial invasion force, the troops used to garrison and control conquered worlds are frequently well-trained, disciplined soldiers. The Blood Pact, which features prominently in the lore of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, exemplifies this. These are not mindless fanatics. They are professional warriors, many of them former Imperial Guard who defected to chaos and brought their military expertise with them. They understand combined arms tactics, logistics, strategic planning, all the elements of successful military occupation. The Blood Pact and similar organizations like the Sons of Sek operate with a level of efficiency that makes them particularly dangerous occupiers. They establish hierarchies of command, communication networks, supply chains, all the infrastructure needed to control a world over the long term. Their discipline means they can be relied upon to follow orders rather than giving in to the chaotic impulses that might lead less organized chaos forces to simply slaughter a population rather than control it. This makes them ideal for occupation duties, where the goal is not just to conquer, but to hold and exploit a world. The typical occupation force is organized along lines that will be familiar to anyone who has studied military occupations throughout history. There are frontline combat troops who can respond to any armed resistance. There are garrison units stationed in cities and key locations, maintaining a visible presence that reminds the population they are under control. There are specialized units for different tasks. Interrogators who extract information from suspected rebels, executioners who carry out punishments, administrators who manage the logistics of controlling a large population. This organizational structure allows chaos forces to maintain control even with relatively few soldiers compared to the population they are suppressing. But the human troops, as dangerous as they are, represent only one layer of the control system. Chaos occupiers have access to weapons and tools that no conventional military can match. Demon engines, creatures of the warp bound into mechanical forms, patrol the streets of occupied cities. These beings combine the malevolent intelligence of demons with the durability and firepower of war machines. They are not simply weapons, but hunters, capable of pursuing fugitives with relentless determination. The wirewolves that hunted resistance members on the occupied world of Geryon exemplify this. Tangled masses of metal and warp energy that refuse to give up a chase, even as their physical forms begin to fail. Another tool of control are the fetch hounds, creatures that track their prey through means both physical and psychic. These beasts can follow a scent trail like any hound, but they can also sense fear and betrayal, making them particularly effective at hunting down those who harbor secret loyalties to the Imperium. Citizens learn to control their thoughts and emotions around these creatures, knowing that even thinking rebellious thoughts might be enough to draw unwanted attention. Perhaps most insidious are the imargos and glyphs mentioned in accounts from Geryon. Imargos are warp-spawned creatures given to each citizen, functioning as a combination of identification card and tracking device. Citizens must have their imago with them at all times, and it must be scanned by occupation forces to verify their authorization to be in a given location. Those caught without a valid imago are executed on the spot. The glyphs work in concert with this system, serving as alarm creatures that sense treachery and betrayal. They manifest as constantly shifting symbols, their forms changing in ways that reflect the warp energies around them. When they sense disloyalty, they sound an alarm, alerting the occupation forces to a potential problem. This combination of physical and psychic surveillance creates an environment where privacy becomes impossible. Citizens cannot hide their location, cannot meet in secret, cannot even harbor private thoughts of resistance without risking detection. The warp-based nature of these control mechanisms means that conventional counter-surveillance techniques are useless. You cannot block a signal that travels through the immaterium, cannot hide from a sensor that reads your spiritual state rather than your physical presence. Curfews are universally enforced on chaos-occupied worlds. After a certain hour, movement on the streets is forbidden without specific authorization, Those caught outside during curfew hours face immediate execution. This serves multiple purposes. It prevents the population from gathering in large groups under cover of darkness, making organized resistance more difficult. It also creates a rhythm of control, a daily reminder that the occupiers have the power to dictate when people can and cannot move freely. The curfew becomes a tool of psychological domination as much as practical security. The punishment for violations, whether of curfew or other rules, is deliberately spectacular and public. Executions are not carried out quietly, but are instead turned into events that the population is forced to witness. The methods used are designed to maximize suffering and terror. Simple beheading or shooting would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, victims might be slowly dismembered, burned alive, or subjected to tortures that can last for hours or even days. The message is clear. This is what happens to those who resist, to those who break the rules, to those who displease their masters in any way. But public torture and execution serve another purpose beyond simple deterrence. They also function as a kind of grotesque entertainment, a regular spectacle that breaks up the monotony of occupied life. Citizens are required to attend these events, to watch their neighbors and friends suffer and die. Over time, the horror of these displays begins to fade, replaced by a numbed acceptance. Some people even begin to anticipate the executions, finding in them a break from the tedium of their own existence. This gradual desensitization to violence and suffering is itself a form of corruption, a way that chaos transforms its victims into something less than human, even without any direct warp influence. The occupation forces also employ informant networks extensively. Collaborators within the population are recruited to report on their neighbors, to reveal any signs of resistance or disloyalty. These informants are rewarded with better rations, preferential treatment, sometimes just with their lives when others around them are being killed. The knowledge that anyone might be an informant creates an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that fragments the population, making organized resistance extremely difficult. You cannot plot rebellion when you do not know if the person you are talking to will report you to the authorities. Children are particularly valuable as informants, and chaos occupiers do not hesitate to exploit this. Young people are impressionable, can be more easily convinced that the new order is normal and that the old imperial ways were wrong. They are encouraged to report on their parents, to reveal any private prayers to the emperor, or any criticism of chaos rule spoken in supposedly private moments. The knowledge that their own children might betray them adds another layer of horror for parents trying to maintain their family's survival. Physical checkpoints divide up occupied cities, controlling movement and allowing the occupiers to track who goes where. Citizens must present their authorization, typically through the imago system or something similar, to pass through these barriers. Those without proper credentials are turned back at best, executed at worst. The checkpoints also serve to segment the population, preventing people from different districts from easily meeting and potentially organizing. A city that was once a single community becomes a series of isolated cells, each one easier to control than the whole would be. The architecture of occupied cities is modified to facilitate control. Open spaces are filled with obstacles or structures that break up sightlines, preventing large gatherings. Buildings that could serve as defensive positions are demolished or modified. New structures are built, fortifications for the occupation forces that also serve as constant reminders of who holds power. The physical environment is shaped to make resistance difficult and escape nearly impossible. Communication between different parts of a world or between different worlds is tightly restricted. Any technology that could be used to coordinate resistance or call for help is confiscated or destroyed. Citizens caught with Vox equipment, astropathic communication devices, or even simple long-range radios face immediate execution. This enforced isolation means that resistance movements, if they manage to form at all, typically operate without knowledge of what is happening elsewhere. They cannot coordinate with other cells, cannot share intelligence or resources. Each pocket of resistance fights alone, making them much easier to defeat. All of these control mechanisms work together to create an environment where resistance seems hopeless and compliance seems like the only rational choice for survival. The occupation forces do not need to be everywhere at once if they have systems in place that make the population police itself through fear and mistrust. They do not need to know about every secret meeting or whispered plan if the consequences for being caught are so severe that most people never dare to try. The systems of control are designed to break the spirit of the occupied population, to transform them from potential rebels into docile subjects who have accepted their fate. Forced conversion and religious life. Perhaps no aspect of life under chaos occupation is more psychologically devastating than the forced conversion to worship of the dark gods. For citizens of the Imperium, faith in the god emperor is not merely a religious practice, but the very foundation of their understanding of the universe. From childhood, they are taught that the emperor protects, that he is the one true god, that devotion to him is what separates humanity from the horror of the Xenos and the heretic. To be forced to abandon this faith, to embrace the very entities they have been taught to fear and despise, requires a fundamental restructuring of their entire worldview. The process by which this is accomplished is both sophisticated and brutal, designed to break down resistance while building up a new set of beliefs that serve the interests of the occupiers. The conversion process typically begins immediately after a world falls to chaos control. The first step is to break the population's connection to their previous faith. As we have discussed, this starts with the public execution or humiliation of ecclesiarchy priests, but it goes deeper than simply killing the spiritual leaders. The spaces of worship themselves must be transformed. Cathedrals and churches that once rang with hymns to the emperor are systematically desecrated and repurposed. This is not done quietly or quickly, but is instead drawn out, made into a spectacle that the population is forced to witness. The desecration follows certain patterns designed for maximum psychological impact. Imperial iconography is not simply removed, but is instead perverted. The aquila, the two-headed eagle that is the symbol of the Imperium, might be twisted into a mockery of itself, its wings bent at wrong angles, additional heads sprouting from its body. Statues of the emperor are defaced in ways that transform them from objects of veneration into objects of horror. His face might be carved with demonic features, his hands reshaped into claws. The goal is to create cognitive dissonance, to make people question what they thought they knew about the emperor and the Imperium. In some cases, the conversion is not immediate, but gradual, a slow process of theological corruption. The chaos priests who take over spiritual leadership do not, at first, explicitly contradict the imperial faith. Instead, they reinterpret it. They might preach that the emperor, in his wisdom, has shown them a deeper truth about the nature of the universe. They speak of the warp not as a realm of demons and horror, but as a source of power that the emperor himself drew upon. They suggest that the imperial cult, with its denial of the chaos gods, is actually a corruption of the emperor's true teachings, and that by embracing the dark gods, they are actually returning to the authentic faith that the emperor wanted for humanity. This approach is particularly effective because it does not require people to immediately abandon everything they believe. Instead, it twists those beliefs, using the framework of the imperial faith to introduce chaos worship. The population is told they are not betraying the emperor, but are instead honoring him more truly by acknowledging the full reality of the powers that shape the universe. For people desperate to maintain some sense of continuity, some connection to what they believed before, this theological sophistry can be appealing. It allows them to convince themselves that they are not really turning their backs on the emperor, even as they perform rituals that would have been unthinkable heresy just a short time before. But not everyone can be persuaded through theological arguments, no matter how sophisticated. For those who resist conversion, more direct methods are employed. The most straightforward is simple coercion: convert or die. Citizens are gathered and given a choice. They can participate in a ceremony of conversion to chaos, or they can be executed. For many, faced with this impossible choice, survival instinct overrides faith. They participate in the required rituals, speak the required words, even if they do not believe them. They tell themselves that outward compliance does not equal inner acceptance, that they can maintain their true faith in secret while pretending to worship the dark gods. This rationalization, understandable as it is, marks the beginning of a descent from which there is rarely any return. The rituals of chaos worship are not empty ceremonies. They involve actions designed to corrupt the soul of the participant. A person might be required to kill someone as part of their initiation, or to participate in depraved acts, or to consume substances that open their mind to warp influence. Each of these actions, even when performed under duress, leaves a mark. The person who commits such acts, even while telling themselves they have no choice, begins to change. The boundary between who they are forced to be and who they actually are starts to blur. For those who refuse even to pretend compliance, who openly defy the requirement to convert, the consequences go beyond simple execution. They are made examples of, their suffering extended and made public to terrorize others into compliance. But their deaths often serve another purpose as well. They become sacrifices, chaos worship, particularly worship of Khorne and Slaanesh, but to some degree, all four dark gods, requires blood sacrifice. The defiant faithful, with their strong connection to the Emperor and their willing acceptance of martyrdom, make particularly potent offerings. Their deaths feed the dark powers they despised, a final cruel irony. As time passes and chaos rule becomes established, religious life on the occupied world takes on its own rhythm. Regular ceremonies are mandated, attendance is required, and the forms of worship reflect the nature of the chaos power being honored. For worlds under specific god's influence, these ceremonies follow patterns we discussed in the previous section. Violent spectacles for Khorne, celebrations of decay for Nurgle, bewildering arcane rituals for Tzeentch, hedonistic revelries for Slaanesh. But all share certain common elements. Sacrifice is central to chaos worship in a way that has no equivalent in the Imperial cult. The Imperium demands sacrifice, certainly the sacrifice of time and labor, the sacrifice of sons and daughters to the Imperial Guard, the sacrifice of lives in service to the God Emperor. But the actual ritual killing of sentience as an offering to the divine is officially anathema to Imperial doctrine. Under chaos, it becomes routine. Prisoners, dissidents, those deemed unfit or problematic, they are brought to altars and killed in ways designed to please the dark gods. Citizens are not just required to witness these sacrifices, but often to participate in them. The psychological impact of being made complicit in such acts cannot be overstated. To watch a person die is traumatic. To actively participate in their killing, even in a small way, even under coercion, does something to the human psyche that can never be entirely undone. The guilt, the horror, the attempt to rationalize the action, these all serve to corrupt the person from within, to transform them into something capable of accepting and even embracing such acts in the future. The nature of prayer changes fundamentally under chaos occupation. In the Imperial cult, prayers are supplications to the Emperor, requests for his protection and guidance, expressions of faith in his divine will. Under chaos, prayers become something different. They are not requests, but affirmations. The dark gods do not need to be asked for blessings. They force their gifts upon their followers, whether those followers want them or not. Prayer under chaos is about opening oneself to corruption, about inviting the influence of the warp into your mind and soul. Children raised under chaos occupation learn these forms of worship from the earliest age. For a child born after the occupation began, the chaos faith is all they have ever known. They have no memory of imperial worship to compare it to, no sense that things were ever different. This is perhaps the greatest victory of the occupiers, creating a generation that sees chaos worship as normal, as simply the way the universe works. These children will grow into adults who do not need to be coerced into worship because they genuinely believe. They will become the priests and administrators of the future, perpetuating chaos rule long after the original conquerors are gone. The educational system on a chaos-occupied world, such as it exists, focuses heavily on religious indoctrination. Children are taught the names and attributes of the dark gods. They learn the proper forms of worship, the correct prayers and rituals. They are educated in the theology of chaos, taught to understand why the Emperor's way was false and the chaos way is true. For young minds, not yet capable of critical thinking, this indoctrination is devastatingly effective. By the time they are old enough to question what they have been taught, the beliefs are already deeply embedded, difficult or impossible to root out. Parents watching their children absorb this education face impossible choices. Do they try to teach their children the old imperial faith in secret, knowing that if the children repeat those teachings to the wrong person, the entire family could be executed? Do they allow their children to be fully indoctrinated, sacrificing their souls to preserve their physical survival? Do they try to find some middle ground, perhaps teaching their children about both belief systems, but warning them to never speak of the Emperor outside the home? There is no good answer, only painful compromises that never quite feel right. As years of occupation pass, the religious transformation of the population becomes increasingly complete. The generation that remembers imperial rule grows old and dies. The generation that was young during the occupation, that was forced to convert, becomes middle-aged and begins to forget what their original faith even felt like. And the generation born under chaos rule reaches adulthood having never known anything different. At this point, the occupation has achieved a kind of permanence. The population no longer needs to be forced to worship chaos. They do so willingly, and they would resist any attempt to return them to imperial rule as a violation of their faith. This religious transformation represents one of the great tragedies of chaos occupation. Physical enslavement is terrible, but it leaves the person's inner self potentially intact. They might obey under duress, but inside, they remain loyal to the Imperium, faithful to the Emperor. Religious conversion, however, corrupts that inner self. It transforms the victim into someone who not only serves chaos with their body, but who has come to believe in it with their mind and soul. Even if such a person were to be liberated by imperial forces, they would not thank their liberators. They would resist, would fight to preserve the chaos rule that has become their understood reality. The rescue would be meaningless because the person being rescued no longer exists. They have been replaced by someone fundamentally different, someone whose very identity has been reshaped by years of enforced worship of the dark gods. Economic and social structure. To understand life under chaos occupation, we must look beyond the violence and religious corruption to examine the practicalities of how a society continues to function under such circumstances. A world occupied by chaos does not simply descend into complete anarchy. Production continues, trade occurs, social hierarchies exist, and people go about the business of survival. But all of these elements are twisted, reshaped to serve the interests of the chaos warlords while maintaining just enough functionality to keep the population alive and productive. The economy of an occupied world must first serve the needs of the occupation force itself. Chaos armies require constant supplies, weapons, ammunition, armor, provisions. The industrial capacity of a conquered planet is immediately redirected toward meeting these needs. Factories that once produced agricultural equipment might be retooled to manufacture lasgun power packs. Forges that crafted civilian goods are set to producing blades and armor. Food processing facilities that prepared goods for the planetary population now preserve and package rations for chaos troops. This redirection of economic activity has immediate and devastating effects on the civilian standard of living. The goods and services that once sustained the population become scarce or unavailable entirely. Shortages become the norm. Citizens must make do with less, much less, than they had before the occupation. Food becomes a controlled resource, distributed according to the priorities of the occupiers. Those who work directly in support of the occupation, who prove themselves useful and compliant, receive adequate rations. Those deemed less essential might receive only enough to keep them alive and capable of basic work, and those who show any sign of resistance or who simply have the misfortune to be seen as useless by their masters might receive nothing at all. The agricultural sector on chaos-occupied worlds presents a particular challenge. Food must continue to be produced, because even chaos warriors need to eat, and the warp does not provide sustenance for mortal bodies. Agri-worlds under chaos control, like Geryon during its period of occupation in the Sabbat World's crusade, continue their function of growing crops and raising livestock. But the produce of these efforts no longer goes to feed the planet's own population or to supply other imperial worlds. Instead, it is shipped to feed the armies of the chaos warlords, to sustain the soldiers and cultists who wage eternal war against the Imperium. The farmers and agricultural workers who produce this food find themselves in a strange position. Their work is valued by the occupiers because it is necessary, which might grant them slightly better treatment than those in other occupations. But they must watch the fruits of their labor being taken away to feed the enemies of the Imperium while their own families go hungry. This creates a particular kind of psychological torment, the knowledge that your work directly supports the evil that oppresses you. Trade between chaos-controlled worlds does occur, creating a dark mirror of imperial commerce. Warlords exchange resources and goods according to their needs and capabilities. A world that specializes in mining might trade ore to a forge world that has the capacity to turn it into weapons. These weapons might then be traded to yet another world that specializes in training chaos cultists who will wield them. The economy that emerges is predatory and inefficient compared to the vast imperial logistical network, but it functions well enough to sustain chaos forces in the field. Social hierarchies on occupied worlds reflect the power structures of chaos itself. At the top are the Chaos Space Marines, if any are present, or the highest-ranking human commanders of the occupation force. These warlords wield absolute power over life and death. Below them are the lesser commanders and champions who lead individual units. Then come the regular soldiers of the occupation forces, the blood-packed troopers or equivalent forces who maintain day-to-day control. Beneath the occupying military sits a class of collaborators and administrators. These are locals who have chosen to work with the chaos forces, serving as intermediaries between the occupiers and the occupied. They might hold positions as civil administrators, managing the logistics of keeping a population fed and housed. They serve as foremen in factories and farms, ensuring productivity meets the quotas set by their masters. They act as informants, reporting on sentiment within the population and identifying potential troublemakers before resistance can organize. These collaborators occupy a precarious position. They have power over their fellow citizens, the ability to make life easier or harder for those around them. But they exist at the sufferance of the occupation force, and that favor can be withdrawn at any moment. A collaborator who displeases their chaos masters, who fails to meet production quotas, or who overlooks signs of resistance, might find themselves demoted to the same oppressed status as everyone else, or simply executed as an example. This insecurity makes them often harsh and brutal in their treatment of those beneath them, as they try to prove their loyalty and value through excessive zeal. The bulk of the population exists at the bottom of this hierarchy, the workers and farmers and menial laborers who keep the world functioning. Their lives are circumscribed by necessity and control. They work long hours at tasks assigned to them, often with little regard for their safety or well-being. The protections that might have existed under imperial rule, minimal as those often were, have been stripped away. There is no appealing to authority for better conditions, no organizing for collective bargaining, no possibility of changing your station through hard work or skill. You do the job you are told to do, and you are grateful if you receive enough food to keep doing it tomorrow. Within this oppressed majority, subtle hierarchies emerge based on the type of work people perform. Those with technical skills that the occupation values might find their expertise gives them a small amount of leverage, a slightly better position. A tech priest who knows how to maintain machinery essential to war production cannot simply be replaced, so their labor is worth more than an unskilled laborer's. A medica who can tend wounded soldiers has value beyond what most civilians possess. These people are still oppressed, still subject to the whims of their chaos masters, but they might be oppressed a bit less than others. Gender roles under chaos occupation vary depending on which chaos power holds sway. Khorne cares nothing for gender. Anyone who can fight and kill effectively has value. This can lead to a strange equality where women and men are equally brutalized and forced into combat. Slaanesh also disregards traditional gender roles, but in pursuit of excess and sensation rather than combat effectiveness. Nurgle treats all mortals the same, seeing only vessels to be filled with his plagues. Tzientch is the most variable, with the treatment of different genders depending on the whims of whatever sorceress cult is in power. Family structures persist under occupation, but they are strained by the circumstances. Parents struggle to protect their children in an environment that is hostile to childhood innocence. Spouses try to maintain bonds of affection when both are exhausted from overwork and traumatized by the horrors they witness daily. Extended families might fragment as members are assigned to different work details or residential areas, or as some choose to collaborate while others resist. The social bonds that normally hold communities together are corroded by fear, suspicion, and the brutal demands of survival. The resistance. Despite the crushing systems of control, despite the physical and spiritual corruption, despite the seemingly hopeless nature of their situation, some civilians under chaos occupation choose to resist. These are not Space Marines or Imperial Guard soldiers, though veterans of those forces might be among them. They are ordinary people, farmers and factory workers, teachers and administrators, who decide that collaboration or passive survival is not enough. They risk everything, knowing that discovery means not just their own death, but likely the death of everyone they care about, because they cannot bear to simply accept what has been done to their world. Resistance under chaos. Occupation takes many forms, adapted to the specific circumstances and the resources available. In the early days of an occupation, when the shock of conquest is still fresh and imperial loyalist sentiment is still strong, resistance might be relatively open. Surviving members of the planetary defense forces might wage guerrilla campaigns from whatever redoubts they can hold. Ecclesiarchy priests might lead their congregations in refusal to participate in chaos worship, accepting martyrdom as preferable to apostasy. But these overt forms of resistance are typically crushed quickly and brutally by the occupation forces. Those who survive learn that they must be more subtle, more careful, if they hope to continue their struggle. The resistance that develops over time is characterized by secrecy and caution. Cells form, small groups of trusted individuals who know they can rely on each other's loyalty to the Emperor. These cells are kept deliberately small and isolated from each other. A member of one cell typically knows nothing about other cells, even if they suspect they exist. This compartmentalization means that if someone is captured and interrogated, even if they break under torture, they can only reveal a handful of people. The damage to the overall resistance network is limited. Communication between cells is difficult and dangerous. The occupation forces monitor all forms of technological communication. Vox channels are watched, physical mail is inspected, Even in-person meetings carry the risk of being observed by informants or chaos agents. Resistance cells develop elaborate systems of coded messages and dead drops, ways of passing information without direct contact. A specific arrangement of objects in a window might signal that it is safe or dangerous to proceed with a planned action. A mark on a wall in chalk or paint might indicate where a message has been hidden. These systems work only as long as they remain secret. Once the occupation forces learn the codes, they become tools for rooting out resistance members. The goals of resistance movements vary. In the best-case scenario, where resistance develops early and has significant resources, the goal might be to actually liberate the planet by driving out the occupiers. This requires coordinating large-scale military actions, hitting the occupation forces hard enough to force their withdrawal, or at least to hold liberated territory until Imperial reinforcements can arrive. Such ambitious resistance is rare and rarely successful, but it is not unknown. The Geryon resistance, covered extensively in Dan Abnett's Gaunt's Ghosts series, eventually contributed to that world's liberation, though at tremendous cost. More commonly, resistance goals are limited to survival and disruption. Cells might focus on sabotage, targeting infrastructure that supports the occupation. A factory producing weapons for chaos forces might experience mysterious accidents that slow production. Supply convoys might be ambushed, their cargo seized or destroyed. Communication networks might be disrupted, forcing the occupiers to expend resources rebuilding them. None of these actions will liberate the planet, but they make the occupation more costly and difficult to maintain. Resistance movements also try to preserve imperial culture and faith. In secret, away from the eyes of informants and chaos agents, they maintain the practices that defined their lives before the occupation. They pray to the emperor in whispered words, careful to make no sound that might be overheard. They teach their children about the Imperium, about the saints and heroes of the imperial faith, trying to pass on these stories even though speaking them aloud could mean death. They preserve books and artifacts from the imperial era, hiding them away in hopes that someday they might be brought back into the light. This cultural resistance might seem less important than sabotage or intelligence gathering, but it serves a crucial psychological function. It reminds people that they have not been completely conquered, that part of their identity remains outside the control of their oppressors. Intelligence gathering is another vital resistance function. Resistance members in positions where they might overhear the plans of the occupation forces or who have access to documents or communications carefully collect information that might be useful. They note troop movements, supply dumps, the locations of important command posts. This intelligence might be used to plan resistance operations, or it might be safeguarded in hopes that it can eventually be delivered to Imperial forces should liberation ever come. The knowledge that someone is watching, that information is being recorded, can itself be a form of resistance, a refusal to let the occupation operate in total secrecy. The most dangerous resistance work involves direct action against occupation forces. This might mean assassination of particularly cruel or effective commanders, attacks on military installations, or the freeing of prisoners held for execution or interrogation. These operations require careful planning and precise execution. A failed attack does more harm than good, exposing resistance members to capture and potentially leading the occupation forces to other cells through interrogation. But successful strikes can boost morale among the oppressed population and can force the occupiers to divert resources to protecting themselves. The personal cost of resistance is staggering. Those who choose this path live in constant fear of discovery. Every knock on the door might be chaos soldiers coming to arrest them. Every conversation with a neighbor might be a test, with the neighbor actually being an informant, hoping to catch them in a careless word. The stress of maintaining this vigilance day after day, year after year, is almost unbearable. It damages people psychologically, leaving them paranoid and unable to trust even those who might genuinely be allies. When resistance members are captured, The interrogation they face is designed not just to extract information, but to break them completely. Chaos interrogators have tools and techniques that go beyond physical torture. They can use warp-based methods to attack the mind directly, to implant false memories, or to tear away the mental barriers that protect sanity. A captured resistance fighter might betray everything they know without even realizing they are doing so, their consciousness invaded, and their secrets plucked from their thoughts. The knowledge of what will happen if they are captured adds another layer of terror to the lives of resistance members. The families of resistance fighters also pay a price. If a resistance member is discovered, the occupation forces do not simply execute that individual. They go after everyone connected to them. Spouses, children, parents, siblings, all might be killed or subjected to torture to make an example and to discourage others from following the same path. This means that choosing resistance is not just risking your own life, but potentially condemning everyone you love to horrible death. Some resistance members choose to distance themselves from their families, breaking off contact to protect their loved ones. But this protection comes at the cost of isolation and loneliness. Despite all these dangers and costs, resistance continues on occupied worlds. Some people simply cannot bring themselves to collaborate, or even to passively accept what has happened. Their faith in the Emperor, their love for the Imperium, or simply their human dignity demands that they do something, anything, to oppose the evil that has taken control of their world. These individuals are heroes in the truest sense, not because they have superhuman abilities or special training, but because they face overwhelming odds and likely death, yet still they resist. The effectiveness of resistance varies enormously depending on circumstances. On some worlds, resistance movements manage to grow strong enough to present a real problem for the occupation forces. They might control portions of territory, operate openly in certain regions, even establish alternative governments in areas beyond chaos reach. On other worlds, resistance is crushed so thoroughly that it barely exists, with only a handful of individuals maintaining the fire of defiance in secret, accomplishing little beyond keeping the idea of resistance alive for a future generation. The Geryon resistance serves as perhaps the best documented example of civilian resistance under chaos occupation in Warhammer 40K lore. During the approximately 3 years that Geryon was controlled by the forces of chaos, a network of resistance cells formed from surviving PDF soldiers, loyal Imperial citizens, and eventually even included elements of the Tanith First and Only, who were stranded there after a covert mission. This resistance engaged in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and direct attacks on the occupation forces. They operated from hidden bases in Geryon's wilderness, moving constantly to avoid detection. They used their knowledge of local terrain to their advantage, striking quickly and then disappearing before chaos forces could respond effectively. But even this relatively successful resistance paid a terrible price. Thousands died over the course of the occupation, either in combat against chaos forces or as reprisals when the occupiers sought revenge for resistance actions. The survivors were psychologically scarred, traumatized by years of living in constant danger and witnessing the deaths of friends and comrades. And even their success in contributing to Geryon's eventual liberation came at a cost that haunts those who lived through it. Some members of the Tanith First, who fought with the resistance, chose to remain on Geryon rather than return to their regiment, unable to readjust to normal military life after the intimate horror of resistance operations. Physical and environmental changes. A planet under chaos occupation does not remain physically unchanged. As the influence of the warp seeps into the material world, as the barriers between reality and the immaterium weaken, the planet itself begins to transform. These changes might be subtle at first, so gradual that people barely notice them happening. But over time, over years of occupation, the world can become something barely recognizable, a place where the normal laws of physics are suggestions rather than rules, where reality itself seems negotiable. The speed and extent of these changes depend on several factors. If the occupation is intended to be temporary, if the chaos forces plan to use the world as a staging ground before moving on, they might make some effort to prevent the world from becoming too corrupted. After all, a planet that has transformed into a demon world is no longer useful for supporting conventional military operations. The logistics of supply and reinforcement become almost impossible when the ground might reshape itself according to a demon prince's whim, or when time flows differently in different locations. But if the occupation is meant to be permanent, if the world is to become a permanent possession of chaos, then its transformation into something alien and horrific is not just accepted, but encouraged. The atmosphere is often the first thing to change noticeably. The sky takes on colors that seem wrong, that human eyes struggle to process. Where once there were blue skies or overcast gray, now there might be swirling purple and green, or a red that seems to pulse with its own internal light. The sun might appear different, its light taking on qualities that cast strange shadows, or that seem to reveal things that should remain hidden. At night, the stars might rearrange themselves, forming constellations that hurt to look at, suggesting patterns and meanings that threaten sanity for those who study them too long. The land itself begins to shift. This might start small. A rock formation that people pass every day suddenly looks different. Its angles changed in subtle ways. A building that stood for centuries develops new features overnight, windows where there were none before, or doors that lead to spaces that should not exist given the structure's external dimensions. Trees and plants begin to mutate, growing in ways that defy normal biology. A tree might develop branches that move independently, reaching out like grasping hands. Grass might turn colors never seen in nature, or might grow patterns that spell out words in languages no human throat can pronounce. Water becomes unpredictable. Rivers might change their courses without any natural reason for doing so. Lakes might drain overnight only to reappear days later in a different location. The water itself can take on properties it should not have, becoming thick like oil, or developing a luminescence that lights the darkness, or changing color based on who is drinking it. Rain might fall upward instead of down, or might fall in only certain locations, respecting invisible boundaries that make no sense. As the corruption deepens, more dramatic changes occur. Gravity might become unreliable. There might be spaces where people feel lighter, able to jump higher than they should, or areas where they are pressed down as if by an invisible weight. Time can become fluid, with some areas experiencing hours for every minute that passes elsewhere, or vice versa. A resistance fighter might hide in a building for what feels like a few hours, only to emerge and discover that days have passed. A farmer might work a field that seems to take a full day to plow, only to look at his watch and see that mere minutes have elapsed. The buildings of cities under long occupation transform in ways that reflect the influence of the chaos power holding sway. Cornate corruption might cause structures to grow spikes and blades, their architecture becoming aggressive and dangerous, with edges that cut the unwary. Nurglite influence leads to decay, with buildings rotting and crumbling, yet somehow remaining standing, covered in fungal growth and dripping with corruption. Sentient corruption produces impossible geometries, buildings that seem larger inside than out, or that have stairways leading nowhere, or that change their layout from day to day. Slaneshi corruption makes buildings almost beautiful, but in disturbing ways, their forms suggesting sensuality and excess, decorated with scenes that draw the eye but fill the viewer with unease. The fauna of an occupied world begins to change as well. Animals mutate, developing new features or abilities. A world's predators might become more dangerous, developing better camouflage or poison, or simply growing larger and more aggressive. Herbivores might develop defensive capabilities they never possessed before. In some cases, creatures that should be harmless become dangerous, or predators that once feared humans become bold, as if sensing that humanity's dominance is no longer secure. Most disturbing are the instances where plants and animals begin to show signs of intelligence or malevolence they should not possess. A forest might seem to actively resist passage through it, with paths becoming confused and travelers finding themselves going in circles. Plants might move when they think they are unobserved, rearranging themselves in ways that trap or mislead. Animals might appear to be watching, their behavior suggesting awareness and intention beyond what mere beasts should possess. For the civilian population, these environmental changes add another layer of horror to daily existence. The world they knew, even if it was harsh and difficult, was at least predictable. They understood its rules, knew what to expect. Now, nothing is certain. The route you take to work today might not exist tomorrow. The building you live in might develop new rooms overnight that you swear were not there before. The food you eat might taste different each time, despite being from the same source. Reality becomes unreliable, and this unreliability is profoundly disturbing to human psychology. Mutations begin to appear in the population itself. These are not always dramatic transformations. They might start small. A person might develop an extra finger, or their hair might change to an unusual color, or they might find their eyes can see slightly into the ultraviolet or infrared spectrum. But mutations, once started, rarely stop. What begins as a minor oddity often progresses over time, the person becoming more and more changed until they barely resemble what they once were. The way these mutations are viewed varies depending on the chaos power in control. Under Khorne, mutations that enhance combat ability are valued, while those that do not are seen as marks of weakness. Under Nurgle, mutations are celebrated as gifts from the plague god, signs of his favor. Under Tzeentch, mutation is expected and almost required, proof that you are changing and therefore pleasing to the changer of ways. Under Slaanesh, mutations are assessed based on aesthetic criteria, valued if they are beautiful or enhance sensation, reviled if they detract from these qualities. For those experiencing mutation, the process is deeply disturbing. Watching your own body change, knowing that you are becoming something other than human, creates a psychological crisis. Some people embrace the change, either because they have fully converted to chaos worship and see mutation as a blessing, or because accepting it is easier than resisting what cannot be prevented. Others resist mentally, even as their bodies betray them, maintaining their human identity, even as their physical form becomes monstrous. Children born on long-occupied worlds often show mutations from birth. A generation grows up seeing these mutations as normal, as simply part of life. They do not have the reference point of remembering a time when everyone looked human. This represents a kind of victory for chaos, the creation of a population that has physically, not just spiritually, been transformed into something new. The point at which an occupied world becomes a demon world is gradual and without clear definition. As warp influence grows stronger, as the barriers between reality and the immaterium grow thinner, the world enters a transitional state. Physical laws become increasingly unreliable. Portions of the world might phase in and out of real space, existing partially in the warp. Demons that would normally struggle to maintain physical manifestation can exist more easily, sometimes even without the need for constant summoning. The world becomes a hybrid, part material, part immaterial, following rules that apply in neither realm alone. For civilians trying to survive in such an environment, the challenges become almost insurmountable. How do you farm when the weather is not just unpredictable but impossible? How do you maintain a building when its structure might fundamentally change overnight? How do you preserve your sanity when reality itself insists that the impossible is commonplace? Many do not manage it. Madness becomes endemic, not the screaming, violent madness of those possessed, but a quieter insanity, an acceptance of contradictions, a willingness to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Because if you do not, if you insist on rational consistency, the world will drive you mad. Children and families. Perhaps no aspect of life under chaos occupation is more heartbreaking than what happens to children and family structures. Children represent hope for the future, the next generation that will carry forward culture and values and identity. But under chaos rule, children become tools for consolidating control. Their innocence exploited and their development warped to serve the interests of the occupiers. Families, which should be sources of support and stability, become sites of anguish as parents struggle with impossible choices about how to protect their offspring in an environment that is hostile to everything they want for their children. Children born before the occupation, who remember life under imperial rule, face a unique set of challenges. They must learn to conceal what they know, to hide the beliefs and values their parents taught them in the time before chaos came. A child who speaks about the emperor in public, who prays according to the imperial creed where others might hear, who expresses any loyalty to the old order, puts not just themselves, but their entire family at risk. Parents must teach their children to lie, to conceal, to live a double life where their public persona differs entirely from their private beliefs. This is a heavy burden for a young person, requiring a level of constant vigilance and self-censorship that is difficult even for adults. The psychological impact of living this double life cannot be understated. Children are not naturally deceptive. They learn honesty and openness as values, and suddenly they must unlearn these lessons, must understand that speaking the truth can mean death. The cognitive dissonance this creates, the stress of maintaining two separate identities, damages developing minds. Children might become withdrawn, afraid to speak at all, for fear of saying the wrong thing, or they might become genuinely confused, unable to fully separate the lie they must tell from the truth they are supposed to believe. Worse still is what happens when children, either through genuine confusion or through deliberate rebellion against their parents, reveal the family's true loyalties. The occupation authorities use children as informants, encouraging them to report on their parents' private conversations. A child might not understand the full implications of what they are doing when they mention to a teacher that their parents pray to the emperor at night. They might not realize that the friendly adult who asks them questions about what their parents say at home is actually an agent of the occupation forces. But their innocence does not protect their family from the consequences of such revelations. For parents, the knowledge that their own children might betray them, either intentionally or accidentally, creates an atmosphere of fear that poisons family relationships. How can you be open and honest with your children when you cannot fully trust them with dangerous truths? How can you teach them your values when doing so might result in them being taken away or the entire family being executed? Some parents choose to shield their children entirely from knowledge of resistance or retained imperial faith, allowing them to be fully indoctrinated into chaos worship in hopes that ignorance will keep them safe. This is a practical decision, but it means watching your children become something you never wanted them to be, seeing them adopt beliefs and values that are antithema to everything you stand for. Children born after the occupation began face a different set of problems. They have no memory of life under imperial rule. To them, chaos worship is simply normal religious practice. The occupation forces are just the legitimate authority, the way government has always worked. These children are raised in chaos indoctrination from their earliest years, taught in schools where the dark gods are presented as worthy of worship, and the emperor is described as a false god or a demon lord who deceived humanity. For these children, there is no internal conflict because they have never known anything different. Parents watching their children absorb this indoctrination experience a unique kind of grief. They are watching their children's souls being stolen, their identities being shaped into something the parents never wanted. But what can they do? If they try to teach their children the truth, they risk the children reporting them. If they remain silent, they abandon their children to corruption. There is no good choice, only different flavors of heartbreak. The education system under chaos occupation is designed explicitly to shape the next generation into loyal servants of the dark gods. Schools continue to operate because the occupation forces need a population with at least basic literacy and numeracy to function effectively in their roles. But the curriculum is transformed. History lessons teach a version of the past where the Imperium was a tyrannical regime and the arrival of chaos was liberation. Science, if it is taught at all, is filtered through the lens of warp understanding, with the laws of physics presented as negotiable suggestions rather than fixed rules. Religious education is constant and pervasive, with children taught not just to worship the chaos gods, but to understand why such worship is correct and necessary. Physical education takes on a dark character under occupation. Children are taught to fight from young ages, not in a structured way that builds character and discipline, but in a brutal fashion designed to weed out the weak. Sparring sessions where children hurt each other are common, with insufficient attention paid to safety. The message is clear. The strong survive, and the weak deserve what happens to them. This creates a generation of young people who are violent, aggressive, and lacking in empathy, perfect raw material for future soldiers in chaos armies. Adolescence under chaos occupation is a time of particular danger. Teenagers, already dealing with the natural challenges of physical and emotional development, must navigate the additional horrors of occupied life. Young people might be conscripted into work details, forced to perform adult labor at ages when they should still be in school. Teenage girls face additional dangers, with no protections against exploitation by occupation forces or collaborators. The age at which a person becomes an adult, capable of being worked to death or thrown into combat, drops lower and lower as the occupation drags on and the population dwindles. For those young people who manage to retain their humanity, who resist the indoctrination and maintain some sense of right and wrong, despite everything they have been taught and witnessed, adolescence becomes a time of quiet desperation. They look around at the world they are growing into and see no hope, no future worth having. Some choose active resistance, joining underground movements despite their youth, seeing fighting back as preferable to passive acceptance. Others simply try to survive, keeping their heads down and their thoughts hidden, hoping to endure until circumstances change. The corruption of childhood innocence is one of the great crimes of chaos occupation. Children should be protected, shielded from the worst horrors of life, allowed to develop in environments that nurture their potential. Under chaos rule, childhood becomes a time of fear and premature exposure to evil. Young people witness violence, participate in religious rituals involving sacrifice, learn to see cruelty as normal. The psychological damage done to an entire generation raised in such circumstances is profound and likely permanent. Even if these children were somehow liberated, even if they grew to adulthood in imperial territory, the scars of their upbringing would remain. Some parents, faced with the impossibility of raising children under such conditions, make the heart-wrenching decision to not have children at all. They see bringing a new life into the horror of occupied existence as an act of cruelty. Better for a child to never be born than to be raised in such circumstances. This decision brings its own form of pain, the grief of potential, of the family that could have been but was sacrificed to prevent more suffering. Extended family structures tend to fragment under occupation. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, all the broader network of family that normally provides support and connection, these relationships become harder to maintain. People might be assigned to different work details, separated by distance, and the restrictions on movement that characterize occupied life, and the suspicions that poison immediate family relationships extend to the broader family as well. Can you trust your cousin not to report your resistance activities? Can you confide in your grandmother without risking that she will, out of genuine belief in chaos or out of fear for her own safety, reveal what you have told her? The loss of family connection is one more way that occupation breaks down the social fabric that makes human civilization possible. People become isolated, alone even when surrounded by others. unable to form the bonds of trust and affection that would normally sustain them through hardship. This isolation makes resistance harder, because organizing requires trust. But more fundamentally, it makes life harder to bear, because humans are social creatures who suffer psychologically from enforced isolation, even when they are physically surrounded by others. The psychological toll, beyond the physical deprivations, beyond the forced religious conversion, beyond the environmental changes and the corruption of family life, there is perhaps the most profound form of damage that chaos occupation inflicts: the psychological and spiritual destruction of the human person. To understand the full horror of life under chaos rule, we must examine what happens to the mind and soul of someone who must endure years or decades of such existence, who must find ways to survive in circumstances that seem designed to break the human spirit. The first psychological impact, one that begins almost immediately after conquest, is the loss of any sense of personal agency. In normal life, even under the harsh rule of the Imperium, a person has some degree of control over their existence. They can make choices, even if those choices are constrained by circumstances. They can plan for the future, set goals, work toward improvements in their situation. Under chaos occupation, all of this disappears. The future becomes unknowable and uncontrollable. Plans are meaningless when the rules can change without warning. Goals are impossible when you do not know if you will live through the day. This loss of agency is profoundly damaging to human psychology, which depends on a sense that our actions matter and our choices have meaning. Helplessness becomes the dominant emotional state. People under occupation learn that nothing they do can significantly change their situation. They cannot resist effectively because the occupation forces are too strong. They cannot flee because the world is locked down and there is nowhere to go. They cannot simply endure and wait for liberation because liberation might never come, and even if it does, they might not live to see it. This learned helplessness leads to a kind of passive acceptance where people stop trying to affect their circumstances and simply react to whatever happens to them. They become almost automatons, going through the motions of existence without any real hope or purpose. The constant exposure to violence and horror creates what we might recognize as trauma, though that term barely captures the severity of psychological injury inflicted by years of occupation. Citizens witness atrocities on a regular basis: public executions, the results of torture, the aftermath of purges. These images burn themselves into memory, creating flashbacks and nightmares that make sleep difficult or impossible. The trauma is not just from witnessing violence, but from being forced to participate in it, to attend executions and cheer for the suffering of others, to perhaps even participate in rituals that involve harming people. The guilt and horror of such participation cannot be easily processed or resolved. Constant fear becomes the background radiation of existence under occupation. Every moment carries the possibility of sudden death or torture. A person going about their daily routine knows that at any time they might be grabbed by occupation forces, might be selected for execution or interrogation for no reason they can understand. Sleep is difficult when every noise might be soldiers coming to arrest you. Relationships are strained when you cannot fully trust anyone, even those closest to you. This perpetual state of hypervigilance exhausts the nervous system, leading to a kind of burnout where people become numbed, unable to generate appropriate emotional responses to situations that should terrify them. The erosion of hope is perhaps the most devastating psychological effect. Humans can endure tremendous suffering if they believe it is temporary, if they can tell themselves that things will eventually get better. But as years of occupation pass, as rescue does not come, as conditions worsen rather than improve, hope becomes impossible to maintain. People stop believing that liberation will come. They stop believing that their suffering has meaning or purpose. They stop believing that the universe is anything other than cruel and arbitrary. This loss of hope leads to a kind of spiritual death, even while the body continues to function. People become hollow, going through the motions of life without any real investment in their own existence. Some people cope by dissociating, by mentally separating themselves from what is happening to them. They go through their days as if watching from outside themselves, as if the person being forced to work 12-hour shifts in a munitions factory or to participate in blasphemous rituals is someone else, not really them. This dissociation provides a degree of psychological protection, allowing them to endure without being completely broken. But it also cuts them off from genuine emotional connection and makes it difficult to form the relationships that might provide support and meaning. Others cope through a kind of splitting, where they develop separate personas for different contexts. The public self, which collaborates and conforms and shows appropriate enthusiasm for chaos rule, becomes distinct from the private self, which maintains inner resistance and loyalty to the emperor. This splitting can be effective as a survival strategy, but it is psychologically costly. Maintaining two separate identities requires constant mental effort and creates internal conflict that never fully resolves. Some people eventually lose the ability to tell which self is real, or they become trapped in the public persona, unable to access the private self even when they want to. The normalization of horror is another psychological adaptation, but one that carries its own costs. After enough exposure to violence and corruption, these things stop seeming extraordinary. Public executions become routine events, barely worth noting. Mutations and environmental impossibilities become just another feature of daily life. This normalization allows people to function without being constantly overwhelmed by horror, but it also represents a kind of moral death. When atrocity becomes ordinary, when evil is accepted as normal, the person has been fundamentally changed in ways that might be irreversible, even if they were somehow freed from occupation. Religious faith, which should provide comfort and meaning during hardship, becomes a source of profound psychological conflict for many under occupation. Those who maintain secret loyalty to the emperor must constantly suppress their genuine beliefs while outwardly conforming to chaos worship. This creates cognitive dissonance that is mentally exhausting. They must participate in rituals that violate everything they hold sacred, must speak words they know to be blasphemous, must perform actions they believe will damn their souls. The guilt and spiritual anguish this creates can be overwhelming, leading some to abandon their faith not out of genuine conversion, but simply because maintaining it is too psychologically painful. Conversely, those who do genuinely convert to chaos worship, whether through indoctrination or simply pragmatic acceptance, often experience their own form of psychological distress. The values they were raised with, the beliefs about right and wrong that were instilled from childhood, do not simply disappear because they have adopted new beliefs. The internal conflict between what they were taught was right and what they now do creates guilt and shame that must be constantly suppressed or rationalized away. Some deal with this through increased zealotry, becoming fanatical in their chaos worship as a way of drowning out the voice of conscience that still whispers that what they are doing is wrong. The breakdown of social trust has profound psychological effects. Humans are social animals. We depend on cooperation and mutual support. But under occupation, every social relationship becomes potentially dangerous. Your neighbor might be an informant. Your friend might report you to save their own family. Even within families, as we have discussed, trust is compromised. This social isolation, this inability to form genuine connections with others, leaves people psychologically adrift. They cannot share their burdens because sharing requires trust. They cannot seek support because support requires vulnerability. Everyone becomes locked in their own private hell, unable to reach out for fear that the hand they extend will be met with betrayal. For children growing up under occupation, the psychological damage is particularly severe because it occurs during formative years when personality and worldview are still developing. A child who grows up surrounded by violence and corruption who never experiences genuine safety or security, who is taught that cruelty is normal and that trust is dangerous, develops a fundamentally different psychology than they would have in healthier circumstances. These are not merely temporary effects that will fade once the occupation ends. They are deep alterations to the structure of personality and the ability to function in relationships. Even if liberated, these children will carry the scars of their upbringing for the rest of their lives. Suicidal ideation becomes common among those under occupation, particularly as the years drag on and hope fades. Death begins to seem like an escape, a way to end suffering that has no other endpoint. But even suicide is complicated under Chaos rule. Some Chaos powers, particularly Nurgle, do not permit their subjects to die easily. Death itself might be twisted, with people unable to end their existence even when they desperately want to. And for those who maintain faith in the Emperor, suicide is a sin that might damn the soul. They are trapped between an unbearable existence and the inability to escape it. Some people cope through purposeful self-numbing, using whatever substances are available to dull their awareness and their emotional responses. Alcohol, if available, becomes a refuge. Other drugs might be used to achieve states of mind where the horror of existence becomes bearable. This self-medication is understandable but ultimately destructive, creating addiction that adds one more layer of suffering to already unbearable circumstances. The occupation forces might even encourage such substance abuse, seeing intoxicated populations as easier to control than sober ones that might organize resistance. The question of collaboration weighs heavily on the minds of many under occupation. At what point does doing what you must to survive become genuine collaboration with evil? When you work in a factory producing weapons for Chaos forces, are you merely doing what you must to earn rations, or are you actively supporting the occupation? When you attend Chaos religious ceremonies, are you just going through the motions to avoid punishment, or are you, through your participation, even if coerced, legitimizing and supporting the system? These moral questions have no clear answers, but they torture those who still possess conscience. The reality is that the psychological destruction inflicted by Chaos occupation is, in many ways, more complete and irreversible than physical damage. A body can heal, given time and care. Buildings can be rebuilt. Land can be reclaimed. But minds that have been broken, souls that have been corrupted, these are much harder to restore. A person who has lived for years under Chaos rule will never be the same, even if they are liberated. The experiences they endured, the things they witnessed and participated in, these will haunt them forever. In a very real sense, Chaos has killed who they were, even if their body continues to live. Case studies and conclusion. Having examined the various aspects of life under Chaos occupation in theoretical terms, it is valuable to look at specific documented cases that bring these horrors into sharper focus. While much of what occurs on Chaos-held worlds is never recorded, there are instances where Imperial forces have retaken occupied planets and survivors have provided testimony, or where Imperial agents operating behind enemy lines have sent back intelligence about conditions. These case studies help us understand not just what occupation is like in general, but how it manifests in specific circumstances. The world of Geryon, featured extensively in the Gaunt's Ghosts series of novels, provides perhaps the most detailed account of civilian life under Chaos occupation, available in Imperial records. Geryon was an agri-world in the Sabbat worlds, relatively peaceful and isolated, before the forces of the Archon captured it. The occupation lasted approximately 3 years, a relatively short period in the grand scheme, but long enough for the planet and its people to be profoundly changed. During the occupation, Geryon's population was forced to continue agricultural production, but all food was seized by the occupation forces for their armies. The civilian population subsisted on minimal rations, with starvation being a constant threat. The planet was governed by a figure known as the Plenipotentiary, ruling in the name of Anakwana Sek. A military force called the Excubators elite soldiers of the Sons of Sek, maintained order with brutal efficiency. The occupation authorities implemented the systems of control we discussed earlier: mandatory identification tokens, called imargos, psychic alarm creatures called glyphs, demon engines called wirewolves for hunting fugitives. Curfew was strictly enforced, with execution being the penalty for violation. Citizens were required to attend public ceremonies worshipping the chaos gods, and were pressured to convert formally from the imperial creed to chaos worship. Those who refused faced persecution and often death. Despite these oppressive measures, a resistance movement formed on Geryon. It was composed of surviving members of the Planetary Defense Force, loyal imperial civilians, and eventually members of the Imperial Guard who became stranded on the world after a covert mission. This resistance engaged in sabotage and intelligence gathering, working from hidden bases in the wilderness. They provided crucial assistance when Imperial Liberation Forces finally arrived to retake the planet. However, the cost of resistance was staggering. Thousands died fighting the occupation, and the survivors bore psychological scars that many never recovered from. The liberation of Geryon, when it finally came, revealed the extent of the damage done to the planet and its people. The physical infrastructure was damaged, but repairable. The environmental corruption was present, but had not progressed to the point of making the world uninhabitable. But the population had been fundamentally changed. An entire generation of children had grown up under chaos rule, indoctrinated into worship of the dark gods. Adults who had been forced to participate in chaos rituals struggled with guilt and spiritual crisis. Some had genuinely converted, finding in chaos worship something that appealed to them. And these individuals resisted liberation, seeing the return of imperial rule as oppression rather than freedom. The case of Geryon illustrates several important points about occupation. First, even relatively short occupations cause damage that outlasts the occupation itself. Second, the strength of resistance movements depends on circumstances. Geryon's resistance was effective in part because the planet's geography provided places to hide, and because key members with military training survived the initial conquest. Third, liberation does not simply restore the status quo. The world that emerges from occupation is different from the world that existed before, and some of those differences cannot be undone. Other documented occupations paint equally grim pictures. Worlds in the Scourge Stars region, corrupted by Nurgle's influence, have remained under chaos control for extended periods. The populations of these worlds have become so diseased and corrupted that they barely resemble humanity anymore. Yet they persist, shambling through their days in a mockery of life, continuing to perform the basic functions that keep their plague-ridden societies functioning. Liberation of these worlds presents unique challenges because the populations cannot simply be returned to normal imperial life. The corruption has gone too deep. Worlds occupied by Horn-aligned forces show different patterns. The populations are typically smaller because the constant violence and the blood god's disdain for weakness mean that many simply do not survive for long. Those who do survive become hardened warriors, so thoroughly brutalized that they have difficulty readjusting to any kind of peaceful existence. When such worlds are liberated, the imperial authorities face the question of what to do with a population that has been shaped into killers, who know nothing but violence and who might struggle to function in normal imperial society. The longer an occupation lasts, the more complete the transformation becomes. Worlds that have been under chaos control for generations become almost indistinguishable from demon worlds. The populations might retain physical human form, but their culture, their values, their entire way of thinking has been reshaped to serve chaos. These people do not see themselves as conquered or oppressed. They are true believers, faithful servants of the dark gods who would resist liberation with the same fervor that imperial citizens would resist chaos invasion. This brings us to one of the most disturbing truths about long-term chaos occupation. Successful occupation creates populations who do not want to be liberated. The children born under chaos grow into adults who know no other life, who have been taught from birth that the dark gods are worthy of worship and that the Imperium is evil. When imperial forces finally arrive to liberate such a world, they might find themselves fighting not just the occupation forces, but the civilian population itself, who see the Imperium as invaders rather than liberators. The tragedy of this situation is profound. The very people that the Imperium is trying to save no longer want to be saved. The question of what to do with such populations, when they are encountered, presents difficult ethical and practical problems for imperial commanders. Can these people be re-educated, brought back into the fold of the Imperium? Or has the corruption gone so deep that they are beyond saving? Different commanders answer these questions differently. Some attempt rehabilitation programs, trying to deprogram the population and teach them proper imperial values. Others, taking a harder view, determine that such populations are too corrupted to be saved, and simply exterminatus the entire world, destroying everything to prevent the corruption from spreading. As we reach the end of this examination of life under chaos occupation, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that liberation, when it comes, is rare and often comes too late. The Imperium is vast. Its forces spread thin across countless threats. When a world falls to chaos, it often remains fallen for decades or centuries, if not forever. The millions or billions of people trapped under occupation live and die in that horror without ever seeing freedom return. Their suffering is invisible to the wider Imperium, known only to them and to the chaos forces that inflict it. For those who do survive to see liberation, the return to imperial rule brings its own challenges. They have been changed by their experiences in ways that cannot be undone. They have participated in blasphemous acts, witnessed horrors that will haunt them forever, perhaps even found parts of chaos worship that appeal to them. The Inquisition often views such survivors with suspicion, subjecting them to extensive questioning to determine if they have been truly corrupted. Some survivors find themselves executed or mind-wiped, despite having remained loyal throughout the occupation, their knowledge of chaos considered too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing. The children who grew up under occupation face perhaps the hardest transition. They must be taught imperial values they have never known, must learn to worship the emperor they have been taught was false or evil. Many never successfully make this transition, remaining forever caught between the worldview they were raised in and the one they are expected to adopt. They become lost souls, fitting fully into neither chaos nor imperial society, tolerated but never fully trusted or accepted. The horror of civilian life under chaos occupation lies not just in the physical deprivations, or even in the corruption of faith and values. It lies in the totality of the transformation, the way that occupation reaches into every aspect of existence and perverts it. Work becomes slave labor in service to evil. Family becomes a site of betrayal and loss. Faith becomes a weapon used against you. The environment itself becomes hostile and unreliable. Your own body might betray you through mutation. Even your memories become suspect, as you cannot be sure if what you recall is real or has been altered by warp influence. To live under such circumstances requires a kind of strength that should never have to be called upon. It requires finding ways to maintain your humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. It requires making impossible choices between terrible options and somehow living with the consequences of those choices. For some, maintaining their humanity proves impossible, and they are consumed by the corruption around them. For others, the cost of staying human is so high that what remains at the end barely resembles the person who began. As we close this examination of one of the most profound horrors in the Warhammer 40K universe, let us remember those who suffer under chaos occupation. Their stories are not often told, their struggles not often recorded. They are not Space Marines with legendary prowess or Imperial Guard heroes whose actions decide the fate of campaigns. They are ordinary people trapped in extraordinary horror, doing what they must to survive one more day, hoping against hope that somehow, someday, deliverance will come. Most will die without seeing it, but their resistance, their refusal to surrender completely to the darkness, their maintenance of even a spark of humanity in the face of overwhelming evil, this deserves to be recognized and honored. If this deep dive into the nightmare of chaos occupation has given you a new appreciation for the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, please consider showing your support for the channel. Hit that like button to help others discover this content. Subscribe to stay updated as we continue to explore the darker corners of Warhammer 40K lore. And if you found this examination worthwhile, share it with others who appreciate the depth and horror that makes this universe so compelling. Remember, knowledge is power, but some knowledge carries a burden. We have looked into this darkness so that we might better understand what is at stake in the eternal war against chaos. In knowing the depth of the horror, we can better appreciate the magnitude of the sacrifice made by those who stand against it. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the nightmare. The Emperor protects, even those who suffer where his light cannot reach.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.